Welcome back to our next video in the Encounter Data Entry series. In this video, we are going to focus on the assessment and plan, as well as the coding within the encounter. So far, you've covered how to enter history and do the data entry within the exam. Now we're approaching the end of the exam where we need to do the assessment, which is, of course, putting in the diagnoses, and the plan at the end of the exam, as well as coding and signing the chart. When we get to the assessment and plan screen, one of the things that will happen, and we can see here, this is where it's going to list out today's diagnoses. There are several findings within different tests in Revolution that can trigger specific diagnosis codes. Now, we're working on building out these findings along with the associated care plans. So I am going to switch over momentarily to a different environment where these are built out. So as you're looking at this, it's just a little warning that will look a little bit different than what you're used to seeing. However, the functionality is the same. So let's talk about a specific finding. In the slit lamp, if I were to pick blepharochalasis upper lid, selecting that finding, and remember I have to hit next to save it, will actually do two things. And this is going to hold true for many findings, but not all. It's going to trigger the appropriate diagnosis code, as well as trigger associated care plan items. So when we get to that screen, it'll probably make a little bit more sense. But I'm going to hop down to the assessment, and we can see that I have a diagnosis for today, blepharochalasis, right eye upper lid. In your environment, it's actually going to default as a finding, and I'll show that to you. But ultimately, once something ends up in the today's diagnosis list, it then gets translated down into the plan screen. So every diagnosis from assessment will be listed out in the plan screen. Notice that when I get here, there are care plan items associated to this diagnosis list. So what's a care plan item? In Revolution, are building out for you, working with the doctors, a library of care plan items. It could be a general care plan item, perhaps a letter needs to go somewhere. It can be a recall care plan item, which specifies a specific day and time that the patient needs to be back. It could be education. And again, please note that this is not your environment. It is a dummy environment where testing is done. It could be medications as well. There is something called care plan templates, where individual care plan items can be combined into a single template. We happen to have a template called blepharitis care management in this environment, which has these different individual care plan items associated. The diagnosis code of blepharochalasis right upper lid is linked to this particular care plan template. That was a long explanation for telling you that, hey, when you get here, it's just going to be there. That doesn't mean that these are all the care plan items that are appropriate for this specific patient. However, it gives you the basis to work off of. Perhaps there's going to be no medication for this patient. I can just remove that particular care plan item. Doesn't mean that my template has been altered. It just means for this patient, we don't have the meds. Now, perhaps there was an education piece that was missed here. I can go back over to my care plan item library and look for the appropriate education piece. I know this doesn't make sense, but I'm going to add that one, and it's going to be in here. So again, you have a library to work from. You're going to have many things triggered. There is certainly going to be an instance where you say, what I need is not in my library. It's not a template. I need to type a little extra something here for a plan for this patient. It's something a little bit unique. So when you have exhausted your options within the library, you can use this add button to type a custom plan. When you do that, please do not check add to library. Remember, there are many providers using this system. This would add it to the library for everybody, which will create a lot of duplicates. If you think something belongs in this care plan item library over here, please pass that along to the office manager. They can contact Revolution or an administrator and add it to the library for you. Please don't add it on the fly. Just type in your plan and hit save. And that's going to, again, add that to today's current plan. Let's hop back into what Team Vision will be used to seeing. And let's talk a little bit not only about the way to trigger a diagnosis, but a finding can also trigger a service code. If we go back into the exam findings, and let's go to the test for final refraction with Prism. When I put in some findings here, I look at this. This patient should be myopia OU, astigmatism OU. But I also did a refraction, so I should have a 92015 that I'm going to bill. Again, the purpose of using an electronic health record is to try and make my life as easy as possible when I get to the end of the exam. So let's go down to the assessment and plan, and let's take a look. Today's diagnosis is empty. That was that comment about, for your practices, all diagnoses that are triggered by findings within the encounter will show up over under today's findings. And that is to allow you to determine what's appropriate for today's diagnosis. So you look at today's findings and you say, yes, that belongs over. Yes, that belongs over. Let's say this patient had diabetes. That's something from the history, and the personal, family, social history. It's not a finding within a test. So Revolution does not have the ability yet to trigger diagnosis codes based off of history items. It's an enhancement. We're working on it. But if this patient has been in before, there are going to be active diagnoses in their file on record. I don't have to start over from scratch every time. I have a second tab. I have a master diagnosis. So this is going to show me all active diagnoses for this patient. And sure enough, the last time they were in, I had diagnosed diabetes. So I'm just going to add that over. It's still appropriate to today's exam. I've also diagnosed glaucomatous flex, but I didn't find that today. So maybe I'll even resolve that diagnosis. Maybe it was a mistake, but I can go ahead and put in whatever reasoning. Can resolve that. It's no longer an active diagnosis for this patient. Doesn't mean I can't find it. Go to all. I can see it's been resolved, but by default, I just want to see my actives. There is also going to be the chance that perhaps a diagnosis was new today. It was not triggered by a finding, and it was not part of the master diagnosis as it was a new finding. I have the ability to add a new diagnosis to the assessment screen by using my plus button. I can go ahead and select a diagnosis and grab it from our last example, right? Type in, if you know what the ICD-10 is, great, you can search by ICD-10. I certainly don't have those memorized anymore like I did the ICD-9, so I tend to look by keyword, and I add that in. So again, we triggered some diagnoses with findings. We can pull a finding from their master diagnosis, or we can add one on the fly. When you get to the plan screen, each diagnosis will be listed out. If there is a care plan template associated to that diagnosis, it will populate the care plan items. You then just edit those items as needed, add from your care plan item library if needed, or as last resort, use the add button to manually type out a new plan item. Now remember, going back to the history taking portion, when this patient comes back in, you have a way in the reason for visit screen to view these care plan items and pull them forward as a reason for visit. Please, if you have to use this add, don't type 10 different plan items into a single box. You're going to be able to pull these forward individually, type each plan individually. There's actually a method to that madness. Once you have completed your assessment and plan, you're ready to code the exam. As I noted, when we put in findings into the final refraction with Prism, it triggered 92015. Several tests will trigger service codes, but there are some services you perform that are not necessarily specific to a single test on 92014. There's nothing that could actually trigger that. A contact lens fitting, there's multiple different types of contact lens fitting. So there are going to be times where you need to manually put in here what the appropriate service code was. There is a common services list to your right. So let's say that this was a new multi-fit. So I can go right here. It's contact lens new fit multifocal. I just use my green plus, and that becomes a service code for today. I did a 92014. That's a service code for today. Perhaps I performed a service that didn't get triggered and is not available in the common services. I can still add another service code from my services library or from my services catalog by using the plus button and searching for the appropriate service. Let's just put in gonioscopy. That one would most likely trigger, but I'm just going to grab that as an example. So this is where you are going to add the services you performed. Many of those will trigger with a little T. There is an auto coding feature, which will recommend the appropriate 99,000 code, which ties in now, new in 2020, with a timer or with medical decision making. We will have a separate video or article that addresses how the timer works and how auto coding works. So for today, we're just going to talk about triggered or manually or added from common service. This is also the screen where you're providing all the information your biller needs. These are the services, but we also need to indicate what diagnosis codes are appropriate to those service codes. Remember, we've got a today's diagnosis, and that's where we put in these diagnosis codes. And we can easily assign them to the appropriate services by selecting. So let's say I'm going to select all of the codes because they all belong with my 92014. But my myopia and astigmatism only belong with refraction and also with my CL Fit. I know this is silly. I just need to put one in there, belongs with the gonioscopy. I know that's not accurate. I oftentimes like to refer to this in old day talk as the electronic version of a super bill. Instead of circling CPTs and ICD-9s, I'm just electronically putting in the appropriate CPTs and the ICD-10s. This is going to translate down to the checkout portion of the exam, which is how the invoices and the claims get created. So this piece is vital for checkout and for billing. Please be sure that this is completed before the patient goes to the front desk. Now, another thing that happens when the patient is handed off and goes back up to check out is that oftentimes there are things that you need done, handouts given to the patient, samples given to the patient. Those can be verbally communicated. Sometimes it's written on a little Post-it and handed off. But in Revolution, we call those checkout tasks. I'm going to go back to that other exam and talk a little bit about checkout tasks because care plan items can be configured as checkout tasks. And so if I hop down into the checkout workflow step, like I'm the front desk, I'm going to see, oh, okay, this patient needs to be back in 3 months. Oh, I got to coordinate a letter to the primary care, and I'm going to get a sample of biotears and hand them off. So these were automatically triggered, but it doesn't mean that throughout the course of the exam, I may be in a screen and think to myself, oh my gosh, I need somebody to give this handout to the patient. There's a tasks button, regardless of where I am in the exam. And when I hit that, give patient the XYZ handout. I can be adding my notes as I'm going through the exam. When the patient gets up to the front desk, again, there we go. We will address during checkout in other video series how this list can be managed. They can be marked as completed. They can be converted to tasks for the task module. There's a report to find uncompleted tasks at the end of the night. So there's a lot of things that can happen with this. And it's a great way to communicate information that won't get lost. Okay, so let's go back and let's finish this exam. I have coded. I am ready to sign the encounter. The sign button, of course, is up here, but what does that mean? Well, the first thing is that every encounter is associated to a provider. Only this provider, when logged into Revolution with their username and password, will have an active sign encounter button. So if you ever get to an exam and that's not active, the first thing you want to check is make sure you're the provider on the encounter. If you're not, you can simply click that hyperlink and select yourself from the list. Once you're able to sign the encounter, it's simply a matter of clicking the button and you must re-enter your password. That's the password you used to log into Revolution EHR. Again, that's why nobody should know what your password is. It is how you keep your data locked down and secure for your patients and your findings. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to close this encounter kind of to refresh it. And here's what I mean. We signed that encounter. If we go look at these tests, notice the red, I can't click into any of these fields. They are now locked down. And only the provider associated to this encounter has the ability to get back into the coding screen and unsign the encounter. If you happen to unsign an encounter, you of course have to put your password back in. It is good to put a note because in an audit, an auditor may want to know why you unsigned an encounter. Once I have unsigned it, one thing that happens is that the screens will open back up. So now I can go ahead, put in my findings, and re-sign that encounter when I am done. Again, it's not that often. And of course, at the end of an exam, you're going to do your coding and your assessment, at very least your coding and your assessment, so that the front desk can finish their part. But there may be things that you're going to go back, notes you're going to make, things you need to finish, but you have patients in 2 other rooms waiting on you. At the end of the day, you might have, in the old days, a stack of charts that you have to finish. In the electronic world, you've got a stack of electronic charts. So how do you find those? If we go back to that home screen, the screen you see when you first log in, all of the patients for that day will be listed, and we have filters. So we could go up here and say, you know what? By default, you'll see all patients. So you can go in here and see the filter and say, show me my charts that have not been signed. Okay, there's the 2 I need to finish. I simply hyperlink to that exam, do what I need to do, get to my coding screen, sign my encounter. I can go back. They're now off my list, and I keep working my way through. And again, that's just a filter. They're not really off the day. They were just because I was filtering out to the unsigned. This particular home screen and this list can be really valuable. And you can see the icons now are green where they're signed and where they are not signed. These 2 do not have a signature because they actually haven't been started yet. So we have worked through the assessment, we've built our plan, we've coded it, we've associated the diagnoses, and we have signed our chart. This completes our video on encounter data entry for the end of the exam. Thank you for listening.